She was not the kind of child her mother had been waiting for. In the small bedroom, silence hung heavy, broken only by the wind rustling the curtains. The midwife froze, unable to believe her eyes. In the woman's trembling arms lay a tiny baby girl, with not 2 but 4 legs. People whispered that it was a curse from heaven or the devil's trick. The mother wept, the doctor said nothing, and the air was thick with fear and the scent of milk. No one could explain why nature had played such a cruel joke. Newspapers would later call her the strangest child of the 19th century. But no one knew then that this fragile creature, with 2 bodies fused into one, would grow into a woman who would make the whole world speak her name. Fate had prepared for her a life filled with trials, love, fame, and mystery. What happened to Josephine Corbin, how she turned her sentence into a legend, and why her grave was later sealed with cement so that no one could ever approach it, you will find out in our story. On the 12th of May, 1868, the sky over Tennessee was heavy, the air thick and still, and in a small wooden house by the road, a woman's cry broke the silence. A young woman, Nancy Corbin, was writhing in pain, clutching the sheets, begging God for mercy. The midwife hurried, bringing water, but something was not right. It was as if nature itself was holding its breath. Then, by dawn, when the first ray of sunlight slid across the window, the world heard the thin cry of a newborn. Yet joy instantly turned into shock. In the cradle lay a tiny body that no one could look at without trembling. The child had not 2 but 4 small legs, and 2 pairs of delicate feet gleamed in the morning light. The midwife crossed herself and whispered a prayer. The mother could not bring herself to hold the baby. She thought perhaps she was seeing things, but no. Wonder and fear stood before her. The infant breathed softly, and there was something terrifyingly normal in that. The doctor, who had come from a neighboring county, was silent for a long time. He did not know what to say. Before him was something he had only read about in medical journals. He examined the child and could hardly believe his eyes. 2 pairs of legs, 2 pelvises, 2 nearly separate bodies joined as one. He had never seen anything like it. The people in the county began to talk. Some whispered that Nancy was cursed, others that she had sinned. But she did not listen. She looked at her daughter and felt her heart fill with a strange warmth. She could not hate this child, even if she wanted to. It was hers. It was alive. And that alone was a miracle. Nancy's husband, William, a strong farmer with rough hands, stood for a long time by the bed without speaking. He did not know how to look at his daughter, but then he slowly knelt down and whispered, "If God gave her to us this way, then so it must be." They named the girl Josephine Myrtle. She grew up quiet but curious, looking at the world with blue eyes that seemed to understand more than grown people did. When she turned 1, she already laughed so brightly that her mother forgot all fear. At first, the neighbors avoided the Corbin house, but later they grew used to it. Children peeked through the fence to see her, while adults pretended not to notice. Doctors came from afar to observe her like a rare specimen, discussed her case, wrote reports, marveled that she could live at all. But Josephine lived. She did not know she was considered a wonder or a deformity. She was simply a child who loved to play, who smiled when she saw the sun. Her mother taught her never to look into the eyes of those who looked at her with pity. And when someone asked why she had 4 legs, she would softly answer, "Because God wanted to make sure I would never fall." And in that answer was everything: faith, innocence, and the quiet strength that would one day astonish the entire world. When Josephine began to grow, it became clear that she was not just a miracle of nature, but a living contradiction that defied every medical explanation. Her small extra legs were weaker, thinner, and moved only slightly, as if they belonged to someone else. Doctors who examined her whispered among themselves that perhaps once there had been 2 children, and one had been swallowed by the other before birth. They said words like parasitic twin and conjoined pelvis, words that sounded cold and frightening to her parents, who only saw a tiny girl with a kind smile and eyes the color of the morning sky. By the time Josephine was 4, she had learned to stand on her stronger pair of legs. Her father carved her a wooden cane to help her walk, and the little girl carried it proudly as if it were a royal scepter. When she took her first careful steps across the yard, her mother wept, not from sorrow, but from awe. The neighbors who had once crossed the street to avoid the Corbin house now gathered by the fence, watching in silence as the four-legged child moved slowly toward the sunlight. Word about her spread through the county faster than wildfire. Some came to see her out of curiosity, others out of pity, and a few out of greed. There were whispers about men who offered money to exhibit the girl, to make her part of a traveling show. Nancy and William refused, clutching their daughter to their chest as if the world itself were trying to steal her away. But poverty is a cruel persuader. When more children were born into the family and food became scarce, the parents agreed to take Josephine to a fair, just for a day, just to earn a few coins. The crowd gasped when they saw her. Some covered their mouths, others laughed nervously, but Josephine stood straight, her small hands gripping her cane, her face calm. She did not cry. She did not hide. There was something in her eyes that silenced the noise, something like quiet pride. People would remember that look for years. Soon, letters arrived from faraway cities, from men who promised wealth if the family would let the girl travel and perform. One of those letters bore the name of the greatest showman in America, who collected all the world's oddities under his striped tents. And so began the strange path that would take the girl from a lonely farmhouse in Tennessee to the glittering arenas of the circus, where thousands would chant her name. But she could not yet imagine what price she would pay for fame or how far her courage would carry her. What she became and the extraordinary life that followed, you will soon discover. When Josephine turned 13, she was no longer afraid of the stairs. She was invited to fairs and traveling shows, and people came from other states to see the four-legged girl from Texas, though she had not been born there at all. The showman had chosen that name because Texas sounded grander, more exciting, a word that promised something wild and impossible. On stage, she was introduced as a rare miracle of nature, and thousands of people came to look at her, paying their last coins for a ticket. She stood beneath the blinding light, dressed in lace, a gentle smile on her face, but in her eyes there was quiet weariness. Her life no longer belonged to her, but to the crowd that clapped and whispered behind her back. She never did anything strange or theatrical. She simply walked out, sat gracefully, sometimes played the piano, and the audience fell silent. They called her a freak, yet she carried herself like a lady, with a dignity that made even mockers lower their eyes. Newspapers wrote about her, doctors argued, scholars traveled to examine her body like a rare puzzle, offering money for the right to study her. But Josephine was not a specimen or a curiosity. She was a human being. One evening, after a show had ended and the troupe rested by the fire, she met him, a young physician named James. He did not look at her as others did, not as a spectacle or an object. He did not ask about her condition or her body. He simply asked if she was tired, if she would like to take a little ride. Walking was hard for her, but his words sounded kind, almost gentle. They left the tent and rode for a long time in a carriage, talking about everything. She spoke of music, of books, of her dream to finish school, which she had been forced to abandon for work. James listened, smiling quietly. He saw not a circus marvel or a headline, but a fragile, intelligent young woman weary of the world's eyes. He offered to pay for her music lessons, promised to help her continue her studies. And for the first time in years, she felt that someone saw not her body, but her soul. Their friendship grew, and soon whispers spread through the circus that the doctor had fallen in love with the four-legged beauty. Her parents refused to believe that such a man could marry their daughter, but they were wrong. What happened next, how that love changed both of their lives, and what fate awaited them, you will discover in our story. They were married on the day Josephine turned 18. The ceremony was simple, with no orchestra, no expensive dresses, yet in the bride's eyes shone something that could not be bought for any price. James held her hand, and in that moment it seemed the world had vanished. No crowds, no stares, no whispers. Only two people who had chosen to stand against everyone. The town was astonished. Newspapers wrote that the doctor had lost his mind, and his colleagues called him reckless for marrying a woman with such a body. But he only smiled and said that he was marrying a heart, not a form. From that day on, a new life began. Josephine no longer stood beneath the bright lights of the circus or listened to cruel laughter. She woke in a small house that smelled of bread and wild herbs, and for the first time, she felt like an ordinary person. James gave her a piano, and she spent hours at the keys, learning to play melodies that sounded like the breath of the wind. Doctors still wanted to see her, sending letters and offering money for the right to examine her, but she refused. Her body no longer belonged to anyone. It was hers and his, who loved her just as she was. One day, Josephine realized she was expecting a child. At first she thought it impossible, for her whole life had proved otherwise. But when doctors came, full of doubt and curiosity, they confirmed it. She was pregnant. No one could believe that a woman with such anatomy could become a mother, and once again the town began to whisper. The papers wrote articles, scholars debated, but she simply placed her hands over her growing belly and smiled. She told her husband that if God had allowed her to be born different, then he would give her the strength to give life. And indeed, 9 months later, a healthy baby was born in their home. Then came a second, a third, a fourth, and a fifth. Each one ordinary, beautiful, alive. People stopped whispering. When they passed her on the street, they bowed and called her Mrs. Bicknell, the doctor's wife, the mother of 5, a woman of grace and courage. The house filled with laughter, music, and the smell of coffee. Sometimes in the evenings she sat on the veranda, listening to her children playing in the yard, thinking that perhaps her strange birth had never been a curse, but a gift, because only someone who has known fear, pain, and humiliation can truly understand what happiness is. But fate had not yet finished writing her story. What happened afterward, and why her name became a legend, you will soon discover. Years passed and Josephine's life became filled with peace and light. People called her a devoted wife, a loving mother, a kind neighbor, a woman everyone respected. No one spoke anymore of the circus posters, of the crowds that once shouted her name, of the people who had paid money just to look at her. She had become part of the town itself, like the old chestnut tree by the gate or the church bell that rang every Sunday. The Bicknell home was warm and full of comfort. In the mornings, she baked bread and taught her children to read. In the afternoons, she played the piano, and in the evenings, she waited for her husband to return from visiting his patients. James adored her. He often said he had never met anyone both stronger and gentler at once. They endured poverty, illness, and loss together, but their love never faded. The neighbors used to say that if happiness had an address, it was their house. No one would have guessed that this quiet woman had once been a worldwide sensation, a woman whose name had filled newspapers across the country. But fate does not easily release those who have once become legend. One spring, when the rain fell heavily outside, Josephine caught a chill. At first it seemed harmless, but within days her fever rose, her breathing grew shallow. James never left her side, calling for doctors, begging them to help, but her strength was fading. She held his hand and whispered that she did not fear death, only that someone might one day disturb her rest, as others had once taken her freedom. On the 6th of May, 1928, Josephine Corbin Bicknell passed away. The town mourned. People brought flowers and spoke softly of the woman who had proved that even in a body defying nature, a beautiful soul could dwell. But the story did not end there. When newspapers printed the news of her death, strangers began to arrive, scientists, doctors, collectors, hunters of the unusual. They offered money, large sums, begging for permission to study her body. Some sought fame, others knowledge, but to James it was blasphemy. He shouted that he would give his wife to no one, that she belonged only to God. When the offers continued, he made a decision that chilled every heart. He ordered her grave to be sealed in cement so that no one ever could disturb her ashes. That night, as the gray stone hardened, a soft rain fell. Drops touched the ground like tears. James stood under the rain and whispered that now she was safe. He never married again. In her memory, he planted an avenue of chestnut trees so that every spring they would bloom like her smile. They say those trees still stand today. With the passing years, the story of Josephine became a legend whispered softly, as if people feared to break its fragile magic. Those who had known her said that light seemed to follow her, as though she carried a fragment of heaven within her. Her children grew up and moved away, yet every spring they returned home when the chestnut trees her husband had planted bloomed with white candles. Passers-by often stopped at the gate to look at the house where the woman once lived, the one who had been born with 4 legs and yet had lived a life full of love and dignity. Young women came to her for advice, and men tipped their hats when they met her in the street. She judged no one, bore no resentment for the years of mockery, as if she truly believed that every pain would one day turn into light. After her death, much changed. Her name faded and reappeared again in articles, books, and medical journals. Scientists argued about her as a rare phenomenon. Some saw in her a biological marvel, others a testament to the strength of the soul over the body. In museums of circus history, her portrait hung beside old posters from a time when the world had not yet learned compassion, but was already searching for wonder. Yet in her hometown of Cleburne, they spoke of her not as a curiosity, but as a woman who managed to remain human when everyone else tried to make her a spectacle. The elders remembered how she smiled at children, how she loved the scent of spring rain, how she once said that if she could be born again, she would live it all the same. To her, life had never been a curse. She believed that God had chosen her not for suffering, but to remind people that miracles are not always beautiful on the outside, but they are always beautiful within. When James died, he was buried beside her. They say that night it rained again, and the drops fell softly on the chestnut trees, as if time itself were mourning their love. Even now, locals still bring flowers there, and the inscription on the stone reads, "She was different, but she was happy." And if you listen on a quiet evening, it seems that among the branches of the old trees, you can still hear her music, the same melody she once played as she learned to draw from the piano the sound of the wind's breath. Sometimes stories live longer than the people who inspired them. So it was with Josephine. Her name ceased to be just a line in old newspapers. It became a symbol of human strength, gentleness, and faith in the idea that everyone deserves love, no matter who they are. People who did not believe in miracles began to believe after learning about her. Doctors used her case as an example for their students, saying that medicine cannot always explain the will of nature. Writers saw in her the image of a woman who defied fate. But for those who had once stood by her grave, it was simpler than that. She had been kind, so kind that even in death she seemed to bring warmth. Old residents of Cleburne sometimes tell that in spring, when the chestnut trees bloom, a faint scent of jasmine lingers in the air, though none grows nearby. They say it is Josephine walking among the trees, smiling as she listens to the wind play her melody. Her story is passed from generation to generation, not as a legend about a woman with 4 legs, but as a tale reminding that miracles are not always ugly, and life does not have to be perfect to be beautiful. She taught people that strength lies not in the body but in the heart, that destiny is not a sentence but a test, and that one can be different and still be loved. Her photograph hangs in an old museum where visitors stop before a plaque that reads, "Josephine Myrtle Corbin, born different, died beloved." And everyone who reads those words smiles softly, as if feeling the presence of the woman who lived the impossible and remained in eternity not as a wonder, but as a human being.